The fluorescent lights in courtroom 4B hummed at a frequency that felt like pressure behind the eyes. And Diane Holloway Fitch, managing director of Holloway Capital, a woman whose firm had absorbed 3 competing investment houses in the past 4 years, sat at the plaintiff's table in a tailored charcoal suit and looked at the man across the aisle, the way you look at something you're already planning to discard. The man's name was Owen Garrett. He wore a flannel shirt with a frayed collar, work boots that had not been cleaned for court, and the kind of stillness that people sometimes mistake for defeat. On the table in front of him sat a manila folder, thin, and beside it, a single black and white photograph of a truck, a 1967 Ford F-100, rust-pocked, the front fender caved, the kind of vehicle that gets towed to a salvage yard and stripped for parts. Diane had glanced at it once and looked away. That thing, she had said to her attorney, loud enough to carry, isn't worth the cost of the tow. She did not know that the man across the aisle had, for 11 years, held a master fabricator certification from the American Coach Builders Institute, one of only 34 people in the country to hold that designation. She did not know that his work had appeared in 3 national concourse exhibitions, that a restored 1953 Hudson Hornet bearing his name in the documentation had sold at Barrett Jackson for $260,000. She did not know any of that because Owen Garrett had not mentioned it. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail placed here is placed with a reason. The truck in the photograph had belonged to Owen's father, Gerald Garrett, who had driven it from Amarillo to Tucson in the summer of 1971 and never driven it back. Gerald had left it behind a rented storage unit on the east side of Tucson when he died, and the unit had gone unpaid. And the photograph was the only proof Owen had that the truck had ever existed in the form he remembered it. He had been 7 years old the last time he saw it running. He was 39 now, and the photograph had lived in the top drawer of his workbench for 22 years, under a piece of glass he had cut to fit. Owen had found the truck 3 months earlier by accident through a listing on an estate auction site. The listing described it as a project vehicle, non-running, significant rust, unclear title history. The photograph in the listing matched the one in his drawer in every particular. The dent above the passenger headlight, the split in the running board, the hand-lettered cattle brand on the tailgate that Gerald had painted himself in the summer of 1969. Owen had driven to the auction, paid $800 for it, and brought it home on a flatbed. What he had not anticipated was that Diane Holloway Fitch had also wanted the truck. Not for sentimental reasons, for a different kind of reason entirely. Her company had recently acquired a hospitality group that was building what her press releases called an immersive Americana experience, a resort in the Sonoran Desert where guests paid 4,000 millas a night to feel like they were living inside a 1960s ranch. The truck, in Diane's vision, would sit in the courtyard as a decorative object, a prop. She had sent a representative to the same auction. her representative had arrived late. Owen had already loaded the truck onto the flatbed and left. Diane had filed a civil complaint alleging irregularities in the auction process. Her attorneys had produced a letter suggesting her representative had submitted a written bid that was not properly recorded. The auction house disputed this. Owen disputed this. The matter had come to Courtroom 4B before Judge Miriam Castillo on a Tuesday morning in March, and Owen had driven himself there in his 2003 Silverado, parked in the public lot, and walked in alone. His attorney, a woman named Priya Suresh, who worked out of a 2-room office on Campbell Avenue and charged rates that Owen could barely manage, had reviewed the auction records and found nothing irregular. The auction house's documentation was clean. Owen's purchase was documented. The title had transferred. The law, as Priya read it, was not complicated. But Diane's legal team was the kind of legal team that understood how to make uncomplicated things feel uncertain. And the hearing had already been continued twice. And Owen had spent $1,100 in attorney's fees on a truck he had paid $800 for. And he was beginning to understand that this was the point. He had not told Priya about his certification. He had not told her about the Concourse exhibitions or the Hudson Hornet, or the fact that the truck sitting in his shop was not, in his assessment, a decorative object. He had not told her because she had not asked, and because Owen Garrett was not the kind of man who offered information about himself without a direct question to answer. He sat in Courtroom 4B with his folder and his photograph and his frayed collar, and Diane Holloway Fitch looked at him across the aisle the way she had looked at the photograph of the truck, and she had already decided what she was looking at. She was wrong. She did not know it yet. Judge Castillo entered at 9:14, and the room stood and the room sat, and the fluorescent lights kept humming. The smell of the shop was the smell Owen had organized his life around for the past 6 years. Metal and solvent, and the particular dusty warmth of a space heater running in a concrete room. The SIC was a converted single-bay garage on the south side of Tucson, on a street where the businesses were modest and the parking was unpaved and the neighbors did not ask many questions. Owen had rented it for $1,100 a month after Claire died. Claire Garrett had died of a cerebral aneurysm on a Wednesday afternoon in October 6 years earlier, while Owen was at a client consultation in Scottsdale. She had been 33. Their daughter, Nora, had been 2 years old. Owen had driven home from Scottsdale in 47 minutes, which was faster than the drive should have taken, and he had arrived at the hospital 7 minutes after Claire was declared. He had sat in a plastic chair in a corridor that smelled of floor wax and something antiseptic and distant, and he had held Nora, who was too young to understand anything except that her father's arms were very tight. And he had stayed in that chair for a long time. He had been, at the time of Claire's death, the lead fabricator at Meridian Coachworks in Phoenix. a boutique restoration firm with a national client list and a waiting period of 14 months. He had been there for 9 years. He had built the work from nothing, from a job sweeping floors at 17 to a bench at 22, to a master certification at 28, and the work had been the kind of work that other fabricators came to study. He had not advertised. He had not given interviews. He had charged fairly. After Claire died, he had stayed at Meridian for 8 months because he did not know what else to do, and because the work was the only thing that felt like ground under his feet. But Nora was in a daycare 40 minutes from the shop, and he was leaving before she woke and arriving after she was asleep. And one morning he had walked into the daycare to pick her up, and she had not looked up from her drawing when he came through the door. And something in that moment had rearranged itself in him permanently. He had given notice at Meridian 2 weeks later. He had found the shop on South Keno Avenue. He had set up a single bay, a welder, a parts cabinet, and a pegboard where every tool had an outlined space. He had taken small jobs, bodywork, frame straightening, the kind of work that paid by the hour and could be interrupted when Nora needed to be picked up. He had told himself it was temporary. 6 years had passed, and he had stopped calling it temporary. Nora was 8 now. She came to the shop after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sat at a folding table near the back wall doing homework, and she had a stuffed rabbit named Clover that she kept in the front pocket of her backpack, one ear always visible above the zipper. She had named the rabbit herself at age 3 for reasons she could no longer remember but maintained were good ones. When she was working on something difficult, she held Clover by the ear without looking at it, the way some people hold a pen they are not writing with. Owen had not told Nora about the lawsuit. He had told her he had a meeting. She had accepted this without comment, which was, in his experience, the way Nora processed most things, quietly and with apparent completeness. The truck was in the shop, covered with a canvas tarp, waiting. Diane Holloway Fitch arrived at the Holloway Capital offices on the 14th floor of a building on East Camelback Road at 7:45 every morning, which was 45 minutes before her assistant, Marcus Webb, was expected to arrive. Marcus had been with the firm for 3 years. He was 26, careful, and had developed the habit of reading everything that crossed his desk before it crossed Diane's, which was a habit she had encouraged and which had made him quietly one of the most informed people in the organization. On the morning after the first court date in the Garrett matter, Marcus had pulled the auction records, reviewed the complaint, and read the opposing party's filing. The opposing party was listed as Owen A. Garrett, sole proprietor, Garrett Fabrication, South Keno Avenue, Tucson. Marcus had typed the name into a search engine out of habit, the same way he typed every name that came across his desk. The first result was a 2019 article from a specialty publication called The Coach Builders Quarterly. The headline read, Meridian's Garrett takes best in class at Amelia Island. The article described a 1953 Hudson Hornet, restored over 14 months, which had won the American Coach Builders Institute's highest award at the Amelia Island Concours d'Elegance. The lead fabricator was named. The article included a photograph of the car and standing beside it, a man in a work shirt who looked directly at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite anything else. Marcus read the article twice. Then he read the auction complaint again. Then he sat for a moment with his hands flat on his desk. He did not bring it to Diane that morning. He placed the printout in a folder, labeled the folder with the case number, and set it in the lower drawer of his filing cabinet under the pending correspondence. He was not certain what he was waiting for. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He did not yet know what the right moment would look like, but he suspected he would recognize it when it arrived. Diane, that same morning, had told her lead attorney to increase the pressure. I want the truck, she had said, not as a statement of desire, but as a statement of fact, the way she said most things. Find a way to make this simpler. Her attorney had said he would. He did not say how. The second court date was set for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Owen drove back to South Keno Avenue, pulled the canvas tarp off the 1967 F-100, and he stood in front of it for a long time without touching it. The rust was deep in the lower quarters and along the rocker panels, the kind of rust that had been working for decades in a dry climate, which was different from coastal rust, slower in some ways and more structural in others. The frame had surface oxidation, but no critical pitting. The cab was solid. The bed floor was gone in 2 sections, but the bed rails were intact. The engine, a 240 cubic inch inline 6, original to the truck, was seized, but seized was not the same as dead. Owen walked around the truck twice, slowly, the way he always walked around a new piece, reading it the way a surgeon reads a chart before making a first incision. He noted the deformation above the passenger headlight, the same dent that had been there when he was 7 years old. He put 2 fingers on it and felt the shape of the steel, the way the metal had moved when whatever had struck it, and he could tell from the shape that it had been a slow impact, not a fast one. A gate post, maybe, or a loading dock corner. Something his father had backed into and never mentioned. He did not feel sentimental about it, or rather he felt something, but he set it aside the way he set aside some things that were not directly useful. And he went to his pegboard and took down the tools he would need to begin. It was a Tuesday. Nora would be at the shop by 3:15. He had 6 weeks before the next court date. He did not know yet what he was going to do with 6 weeks. He knew what he was going to do with the truck. He put on his work gloves, pulled the shop light down on its cable until it hung directly over the engine bay, and began. The Tucson Automotive Heritage Concours was held every year in late October at Reed Park, under the shade of the big eucalyptus trees along the north lawn, and the event had grown over the past decade from a modest club gathering into something that drew collectors and restorers from 4 states. The registration committee had received Owen's application in early September. They had reviewed the documentation he submitted: the provenance chain, the restoration log, the American Coach Builders Institute certification number, and they had accepted the 1967 Ford F-100 into the Working Class American Vehicles class without delay. The chief judge that year was a man named Raymond Fuqua, who had been evaluating Concours vehicles for 23 years and who had, in 2019, written the technical assessment that accompanied the Hudson Hornets Best in Class award at Amelia Island. He had written Owen's name in that assessment. He remembered it. Owen had not contacted Raymond Fuqua. He had submitted the paperwork and waited. Priya Suresh had filed a motion in the Garrett matter requesting that the court take judicial notice of the truck's current condition and assessed value as relevant to the question of damages. Diane's attorneys had objected. Judge Castillo had granted a 60-day continuance and indicated she would review any appraisal documentation submitted by either party. It was, Priya told Owen over the phone, a narrow opening, not a victory, a window. Owen had said he understood. He had hung up and gone back to the shop. The truck sat under the October morning light at Reed Park with a quality that was difficult to describe to someone who had not spent time around well-restored vehicles. It was not shiny in the way that draws attention to itself. It was correct. The paint was a period-accurate Rangoon red, mixed to a formula Owen had sourced from a Ford paint code document dated 1966. And it sat on the steel the way original paint sits, not on top of the surface, but in it. The kind of depth that comes from proper preparation rather than product. The chrome was replated, not replaced. The glass was original. The bed floor was white oak, cut and fitted to the original dimensions, oiled but not varnished, because the original had been oiled and not varnished. Every decision had a documented reason. Raymond Fuqua arrived at 8:15 and walked the show field for an hour before he reached Owen's truck. He spent 11 minutes with it. He moved around it slowly, the way Owen had moved around it in the shop on that first Tuesday in March, reading the surface, checking the gaps, running a finger along the door seam. He crouched and looked at the undercarriage. He opened the hood and stood for a moment looking at the engine bay, which was clean and correct and showed the kind of assembly discipline that is either present or absent. It cannot be approximated. He straightened up and looked at Owen, who was standing 10 feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets. "Garrett," Raymond said. It was not a question. Owen said yes. Raymond looked back at the truck. He said, "The engine runs?" Owen said it did. Raymond nodded once, and the way a man nods when something confirms what he already suspected. And he made a note on his clipboard and moved on. Nora was sitting on a folding chair behind the truck with Clover in her lap, watching the judges move through the field. She had been watching for a long time without saying anything, which was her way. When Raymond Fuqua walked away, she looked at Owen and said, "He looked at it like he was reading it." Owen said that was what he was doing. Nora considered this. "Like homework," she said. Owen said, "Yes. Something like that." She turned back to the field, holding Clover by one ear, and said nothing else. The awards were announced at 2 in the afternoon, under the eucalyptus trees, by a woman with a microphone who read from a printed list. Working Class American Vehicles Best in Class was announced third. The truck's name in the documentation was listed as Gerald's Truck, which was what Owen had written on the registration form in the space-marked vehicle name. And when the woman read it aloud over the microphone, it sounded like a plain statement of fact, which was what it was. Owen walked to the front to receive the award. He shook Raymond Fuqua's hand. Raymond held the handshake a beat longer than necessary and said quietly, "The Hudson was better work. This one is more honest." Owen said thank you and walked back to where Nora was sitting. She looked at the award, which was a cast metal plaque with the concourse seal and the year and the class designation. "Is that heavy?" she asked. Owen held it out. She took it in both hands, weighed it, and handed it back. "It is," she said. The concourse's results were published on the event's website that evening, with photographs, and Raymond Fuqua's written assessment was attached as a downloadable document. The assessment described the truck in technical terms: the paint formula, the chassis work, the engine rebuild, the documented provenance, and concluded with a sentence that read, "This vehicle represents a standard of period-correct restoration rarely been achieved at any level of an investment, and reflects the work of a fabricator operating at the highest level of the discipline." Raymond Fuqua had signed it with his name and his ACI credential number. Priya filed it with the court the following morning as Exhibit F. Marcus Webb had been at the concourse. He had not told Diane he was going. He had driven to Reed Park on a Saturday morning in his own car, parked in the public lot, and walked the show field alone. He had found the truck without difficulty. It was the kind of vehicle that stopped people, and he had stood in front of it for several minutes, reading the surface the way he had learned to read documents, looking for the thing that was not immediately visible. He had taken a photograph on his phone, not of the truck, of Owen standing 10 feet away with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching a judge work. He had driven back to Phoenix that afternoon and placed the photograph in the folder in the lower drawer of his filing cabinet, with the Coach Builders quarterly article and the auction records and the case number on the tab. He had not yet decided what he was waiting for. He thought he might be close. Diane Holloway Fitch received the Concourse documentation through her attorneys on a Wednesday, attached to Priya's filing, and she read Raymond Fuqua's assessment in her office on East Camelback Road with the door closed. She read it twice. The language was technical and specific and carried the weight of professional opinion rendered by someone with 23 years of documented authority in the field, and it described the truck she had called not worth the cost of the tow in terms that made her characterization look like something said without information. She sat for a moment with the document on her desk. Then she picked up her phone and called her lead attorney. She told him she wanted to discuss settlement. Her attorney asked what terms she was considering. Diane said she would call him back. She looked at the document again. She looked at the photograph of the truck, which was attached as an exhibit, and which showed the Rangoon red paint under October light in a way that made it look like something that had been waiting a long time to be seen correctly. She called Marcus into her office. She told him to find out if Owen Garrett took outside commissions. Marcus said he would look into it. He did not mention the folder in the lower drawer. He did not mention that he had been to Reed Park on a Saturday morning, or that he had stood in front of the truck himself, or that he had understood, standing there, something about the difference between what a thing costs and what it is worth. He said he would look into it, and he left. 3 days later, Diane appeared in Judge Castillo's courtroom, and her attorney announced that Holloway Capital was withdrawing the complaint. The withdrawal was unconditional. There were no terms, no counterfilings, no negotiated language. The complaint was withdrawn. The title to the truck remained with Owen Garrett, and Judge Castillo acknowledged the withdrawal with the same expression she brought to everything that happened in Courtroom 4B. Attentive, neutral, and entirely unsurprised. Owen sat at the plaintiff's table and did not move for a moment after the announcement. Then he straightened the folder in front of him and capped his pen. Priya, sitting beside him, said quietly, "That's it." Owen said he knew. Outside the courthouse, in the parking lot, Diane Holloway Fitch stopped on the sidewalk as Owen walked past. She was standing with her attorney, and she turned, and she said, "Mr. Garrett?" Her voice had changed, not softened exactly, recalibrated, the way a person's voice changes when they have revised an estimate and are acknowledging the revision without performing it. "I said something at the auction," she said, "about the truck. It was unkind." Owen stopped. He looked at her. His face was still. She said her company was developing properties that required the kind of work he did, and that she would like to have a conversation about that if he was open to it. Owen said he would think about it. He said it the same way he said most things, quietly, without inflection, without the kind of pause that signals deliberation. He said it, and he walked to his truck, the 2003 Silverado. and he got in and he drove south on Stone Avenue toward South Keno Avenue, and Diane Holloway Fitch stood on the sidewalk and watched him go. Owen pulled into the shop at 11:47. He unlocked the bay door, rolled it up, and turned on the overhead light. Gerald's truck sat in the center of the bay under the fluorescent light, the Rangoon red paint catching the beam the way it had caught the Arbor sun at Reed Park, deep and correct and still. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the way he felt at the end of a long job done correctly. A specific, quiet completion, the kind that does not announce itself. He registered it. He set it aside. He locked the bay, got back in the Silverado, and drove home. Nora was asleep when he arrived. She was in her bed with Clover tucked under one arm, one ear visible above the blanket edge. Owen stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. The house was quiet. The street outside was quiet. Through the window above her bed, the light from the neighbor's porch fell in a narrow rectangle across the floor, and it was the only light in the room, and it was enough. He had not told her about the withdrawal. He would tell her in the morning if she asked. She might not ask. She had a way of understanding the shape of things without requiring the details, which was, Owen had come to believe, a kind of intelligence that most people did not recognize because they were looking for a different kind. He pulled her door almost closed and went to the kitchen and sat down. Some things are worth exactly what they appear to be worth, and some things are worth what only a careful eye can find. And the difference between those two categories is not luck. It is attention. It is the willingness to look long enough and carefully enough to see what is actually there, rather than what is convenient to see. Owen Garrett had spent 20 years learning to look that way. He had learned it at a bench with his hands 1 hour at a time. The porch light was on outside the kitchen window. It cast a plain yellow rectangle on the driveway, and the driveway was empty, and the night was still. He sat at the table in the quiet and did not move for a long time.